Hi, I'm Peyton, and my Inquisitive Mind of the Learner project is the question I decided to explore, is how can reading tests be designed or adapted more accurately with technology to measure the abilities of students with dyslexia? I chose this topic because I personally have dyslexia, and I actually have thought about this topic before about how I don't really feel that traditional reading tests that we do for students now are necessarily the most accurate or the best way to test for dyslexia. I feel like they make students feel very isolated. I feel like they can make students very uncomfortable, and I feel like they're just not the most, they're just not accurate. They're not testing for all symptoms of dyslexia, so there might be students kind of slipping through the cracks, and I just personally feel like an individualized learning style being implemented with them would just improve them tremendously. So also I have my notes over here, so if you see me looking over here, because my notes are right here, and if I didn't have my notes, I would ramble, and this would be a 30-minute long video. So let's get into it. Let's start with talking about dyslexia. It doesn't mean they can't learn or they aren't intelligent. It just means the brain processes written language differently. But yet, most reading tests are designed for students who read in a very specific linear way. So I wanted to know, how can we change that? How can schools design tests that actually measure understanding, not just speed or decoding skills? To answer that, I looked at 3 recent sources to explore dyslexia assessment. The first source was the 2021 study from the International Journal of Educational Research. It looked at how timed reading tests can underestimate comprehension skills in students with dyslexia. The researchers found that when students were given more time, or when time limit was removed, their comprehension scores improved dramatically. What that told me is that when a test is too focused on speed, it's not really testing comprehension anymore. It's testing how fast a person can decode. For a student with dyslexia, who might take longer to process words, that can make a big difference. So there's another thing. So I remember getting pulled out of class and doing these very fast-paced tests. They would give you a time limit, and you would have to read as much of the passage as you could. One, that's very overwhelming for children. And 2, a lot of people, not just students with dyslexia, underperform when given a time limit because then they're not focused on actually comprehending, and you're not actually getting you're not getting anything out of that test besides an anxious kid and scores that don't actually reflect their comprehension and decoding skills. The second source was a 2022 article in Reading and Writing, an interdisciplinary journal. This one focused on alternative assessment methods, for example, using oral response, audiobooks, or digital tools like text-to-speech. The researchers in this study found that when students with dyslexia were allowed to listen to the passages and answer questions orally, their scores came much closer to those of their non-dyslexic peers. That made me think, maybe it's not the student who's underperforming, maybe it's a test that's not flexible enough to capture what the student actually understands. And I say this all the time, that I would much rather sit there and take every single test orally. It's just how my brain processes it with dyslexia, because the visual aspect can be so hard and comprehend, especially because the world is not made. Curriculum is not made with non-typical children in mind. Tests are made with dyslexic kids in mind. So something as simple and something that can be so easily overlooked, and so oftentimes is just the spacing of the letters, the font used, the darkness of the letters, how close letters are, how close the lines are. Stuff that a typical or non-dyslexic student wouldn't even realize if it was changed, but it makes so much of a difference for students with dyslexia. My notes right now are double spaced with a thick font, and my letter spacing is wider. Because dyslexia, it's so odd how our brain can just warp everything, but the tiniest little thing of spacing it out can truly make a world of difference for students with dyslexia. And the third source I used was a 2023 report from the British Dyslexia Association about Universal Design for Learning, or UDL. This approach says that accessibility shouldn't be an afterthought. Instead, assessments should be built from the start to include options that work for different kinds of learners. It's kind of what we were just talking about, is making sure that accessibility isn't an afterthought. It's what we think of from the beginning, because no one will be harmed by having too many options for accessibility. That's only going to open up more learning opportunities for different kinds of learners. That might mean adjusting font sizes, more white space between lines, built-in screen reader. What I really liked about this approach is that it doesn't just help students with dyslexia, it helps everyone. Universal design benefits students who are English learners, those with ADHD, or even students who just get test anxiety. So, like I said, just making sure that helping one type of student isn't a negative for everyone, and making these tests with accessibility in mind is only going to benefit everyone. And after reading and comparing these sources, I noticed a clear pattern. Students with dyslexia often understand far more than traditional reading tests can show. All three studies point to one big problem. The way we currently test reading tends to conflate decoding skills, or the ability to read words on a page, and with comprehension skills, which is the ability to understand meaning. They're two different things. Timed or written tests, which emphasize decoding speed, often punish students with dyslexia for something that isn't actually related to comprehension. Just because a student can read fast doesn't mean they can't read. It just means they can't read fast or in a timed, controlled, stressful situation. And I don't know how many times it's happened to you, but I've never in my life, had a gun to my head, time limit on stuff. I feel like those tests just aren't realistic of what a student is actually going to be facing, because in the real world, you can take your time. You can read stuff over. You don't have to be lightning fast. And I feel like it just adds more stress and, humiliation to the student. That's so unnecessary. Where did I leave off? How we could rethink testing. What if reading comprehension was measured in multiple ways? For example, through oral discussion, creative projects, digital platforms where students can listen and respond in writing or speech. Like I said, just overall more options for students to respond and showcase their skills. This idea connects something I learned in this course, critical thinking about assessment. If we believe the goal of the assessment is to improve learning, not just label it, then the test should adapt to students, not the students should be adapted to the testing. What does this mean for the future of education? How can we include technology? We need to first schools need to rethink what a fair test looks like. Fair doesn't mean identical. Fair doesn't mean equal. It means equitable. So fair means giving every student the opportunity to show what they know, even if that means showing it in different ways. That could include accommodations like extra time, text-to-speech, or even allowing oral explanations for comprehension. These supports don't give students with dyslexia an unfair advantage. They simply remove barriers that should have never been there in the first place. Secondly, teachers and test developers should apply UDL and UDP, Universal Design of Learning, and Universal Design Principles whenever possible. Instead of modifying tests later for students, it should be the first thought, is how do we make sure this test is accessible for everyone? And finally, I think overall, we should just shift how we talk about ability. A test score is not the same as intelligence. A reading test score is not the same as comprehension, because the reading tests we implement now really just test decoding and speed. And for a student with dyslexia, not even just students with dyslexia, students with processing disorder, students with ADHD, multiple different types of learning challenges cause, or even just anxiety, can make it so that a timed test is just not the best environment for a child or for a student to really showcase their ability. And decoding is important. However, decoding quickly is just not as important as comprehension. Reading comprehension is our goal. It's for students to be able to understand reading. So to do that, I think we can just look at other ways, because not every student learns the same, and I think by now we all know that, and so it's important to keep that in mind when making our curriculum. All right, and that was all I had, so thank you so much for listening. Thank you.